for me was the best player I ever played with. True, like Mike Hill used to say, we need guys that will flip the field, that can change the game. And Rickey was a true game changer in all aspects of it, and the best player I've ever played with.
You are watching a split screen right now. On one side, Dave Winfield, one of the greatest players who ever put on a baseball uniform, is talking about how much he loved Rickey Henderson. On the other side, Rickey himself is on the field doing exactly what he always did, laughing, dancing, making the whole game about him. And right there in those two images side by side, you have the entire story. Because the same man that Winfield called a great friend was also the man that people inside baseball spent decades calling a problem. A showboat, a disgrace, someone the sport could never quite forgive. And here's what makes it so wild. Nobody doubted how good he was, not even the people who hated him most. Rickey Henderson was a once-in-a-lifetime player, the best leadoff hitter who ever lived, a man who broke records that may never be touched again. But somehow none of that was enough to make the old guard forgive him. The question was never really about talent. The question was always something deeper. How does the greatest base runner in the history of the sport end up with enemies on every single team he ever played for? Real quick, if this story is already pulling you in, tap the hype feature and give this video some hype. It really does help, and trust me, we are just getting started on this one. Here's the thing that nobody talks about enough. When Rickey Henderson passed away due to complications from pneumonia, the tributes came flooding in, and something strange happened. The very men who had publicly clashed with him, who had called him names, who had complained about him to the press, they all came out and said how much they appreciated him. Dave Winfield, who had shared a clubhouse with him in New York during some of the most tense years of both their careers, was the very first person to break the news online. He wrote that he could not believe he had lost one of his favorite teammates and a great friend. Don Mattingly talked warmly about their friendship and expressed massive respect for the way Rickey had taken care of his body throughout his career. Even people who had been openly critical in print were now singing his praises. That gap between how people talked about Rickey while he was playing and how they talked about him after he was gone tells you everything. It tells you that the grudges were absolutely real, but the respect underneath them was real too. And today we are going to dig into every single grudge. We are counting down 9 relationships where baseball had a serious problem with Rickey Henderson. We are starting with the one that gets talked about the least and building all the way down to the moment that defined everything. Number 9 down to number 1. Let's go. Number 9, Dennis Eckersley. Dennis Eckersley was one of the best closers in the history of the game. He was intense, precise, and he held himself to an impossibly high standard. When he took the mound in the 9th inning, he expected perfection from himself and expected the same kind of commitment from the 8 players standing behind him. So when Rickey Henderson decided to sit out a game with a minor injury, the kind of thing that most players in that era were expected to tape up and push through, Eckersley had a serious problem with it. The thinking in baseball at that time was not complicated. You play unless you physically cannot walk. You grind, you show your teammates you are willing to hurt for the cause, and you never let a little pain become an excuse to rest. That was the Warrior Code. And in Oakland, where manager Tony La Russa ran one of the most disciplined and detail-oriented operations in the entire league, that code was taken very seriously. Rickey simply did not see it that way. To him, sitting out with a nagging hamstring or a tender knee was not weakness. It was sensible. He knew his body better than anyone else did. He understood that playing at 70% for a week might cost him 3 weeks later. He thought about his career in long-term numbers in a way that most players of his generation simply did not. Here is the kicker. He was completely right. Rickey played professional baseball until he was 44 years old. He played in the big leagues longer than most careers even last. The same body maintenance that Eckersley and others read as laziness was actually a deliberate long-game strategy, and it worked brilliantly. Mattingly himself admitted years later that he wished he had taken that same approach. Playing through pain had destroyed Mattingly's back and cost him his best years. He finished his career full of regret about the very thing Rickey had refused to do, but none of that mattered in the moment. In that era, choosing to rest when your teammates were playing was seen as abandonment. And a perfectionist like Eckersley, a man who poured every ounce of himself into every single appearance on the mound, could not accept a teammate who seemed to be choosing comfort over contribution. It looked selfish. It looked soft. And in the culture of professional baseball in the late 1980s and early 1990s, soft was about the worst thing you could be. Number 8. Kirk Gibson. If you want to understand why Kirk Gibson had a problem with Rickey Henderson, you only need to understand one thing about Gibson himself. He was a man who believed in team above everything else. Team first. Always. No exceptions and no room for debate. He was the kind of player who would destroy his own body for a single win and feel nothing but pride about it the next morning. He was made for the grit and sacrifice version of the sport. Rickey Henderson spoke about himself in the third person. He would say things like, "Rickey knows what Rickey can do." Or when he made a mistake, he would say, "Rickey, what are you doing out there?" He later explained it as a way of holding himself accountable. By creating a small mental distance between his identity and his performance, he could correct himself without collapsing emotionally after a rough play. He called it a form of self-talk, a way of coaching himself in the moment. To Gibson, this was pure, undiluted ego. It was a player so thoroughly wrapped up in his own legend that he could not even refer to himself the way normal people do. It was alienating. It was bad for group chemistry. When you are trying to build a room full of men who trust each other and sacrifice for each other and believe in something bigger than themselves, having a teammate who speaks about himself like he is already a bronze statue in a museum makes the whole thing very difficult. Two specific stories stuck around as proof of exactly what Gibson was talking about. The first one happened when Rickey was playing with the Padres in 2001. His teammate Phil Nevin offered him $100 for every teammate he could correctly name on the bus. Rickey did not take it as a fun game. He took it as an insult. His response to Nevin was rude, direct, and made it clear that he considered the whole thing beneath him. He knew who his teammates were. He just did not feel like proving it. The second story involved Harold Reynolds. During a season when Rickey was injured and sitting out, Reynolds led the American League in stolen bases. When the season ended, Rickey called him up, not to congratulate him, not to talk baseball. He called to say 60 bases? Man, Rickey got 60 by the All-Star break. Then he hung up. No small talk, no warm send-off. Just a quick reminder of where everyone stood in the hierarchy, delivered in 3 seconds flat. Gibson saw this constant need to remind everyone around him of his greatness as a cancer for a clubhouse. And while that same relentless self-belief was probably a major part of what separated Rickey from every other player on the field, sharing a locker room with it day after day was genuinely exhausting. Number 7. Goose Gossage. Out of everyone on this list, Goose Gossage was the loudest critic, the most direct, the most willing to sit down in front of a microphone or a reporter and say exactly what he thought about Rickey Henderson with his full name attached. And what Gossage thought was that Rickey was a showboat and a disgrace to the entire history of the game. Gossage was an old-school power pitcher who believed in intimidation, in guts, in the pure one-on-one confrontation between a pitcher trying to blow a ball past a hitter and a hitter trying not to let that happen. He believed baseball had a dignity worth protecting, a tradition worth honoring, and he believed Rickey Henderson was one of the most damaging forces that tradition had ever encountered. The specific thing that burned under Gossage's skin the most was not just Rickey's own behavior. It was what Rickey was doing to the young players watching him. When Jose Canseco arrived in Oakland, he was one of the most physically gifted prospects the sport had seen in a generation. He had thunder in his bat, genuine speed, and the tools to be a complete player in every sense of the word. But according to Gossage, Rickey got to Canseco early and pointed him in the wrong direction. Gossage claimed in his book that Rickey told Canseco to focus on hitting home runs because dingers were what got you big bucks. Forget the defense. Forget the fundamentals. Just hit home runs and get paid. To Gossage, this was not just bad advice from one player to another. It was a moral hazard. It was the most influential player in the Oakland clubhouse, using his status to corrupt the next generation, to replace the ideal of the complete, selfless ball player with the chase for personal stats and personal paydays. Gossage watched Canseco narrow into a home run specialist and blamed that shift, at least partially, on the culture that Rickey helped build. In Gossage's view, Rickey was not just a problem himself. He was a symptom of a deeper commercial rot eating at the sport from the inside. And for a man who loved the game as much as Gossage did, that made it personal. Number 6. George Steinbrenner. George Steinbrenner was not really a baseball man, in the traditional sense of the word. He was a businessman who happened to own the most famous baseball team in the world. And like any businessman, what he valued above almost everything else was loyalty, commitment, and the certainty that everyone inside his organization was pulling in the same direction. Rickey Henderson made that certainty very, very difficult to hold on to. Their relationship was a cycle that never seemed to end. On one hand, Steinbrenner understood the value of what Rickey brought to the lineup. You do not pass up the greatest leadoff hitter alive. You sign him, and you put him at the top, and you watch the runs pile up. On the other hand, Rickey treated his contract less like a completed deal and more like an ongoing conversation that never fully reached a conclusion. He was always pushing, always looking for a better arrangement, always making sure that everyone around him understood that the business side of things mattered to him just as much as the baseball side. There is a story that captured the whole dynamic perfectly. Rickey received a signing bonus check for $1 million, and he did not cash it. Not because he lost it and not because he forgot. He framed it. He put it on display because he was proud of the number. To Steinbrenner, who viewed players as assets and contracts as binding agreements of loyalty, this was beyond strange. The man had been handed a check for $1 million and had treated it as a trophy rather than money. The answer to why Rickey did that was actually simple. He knew his worth. He had always known his worth. The framed check was not carelessness. It was a statement. But in Steinbrenner's world, there was no room for that kind of statement from a player. Players were supposed to feel grateful, to show up, to perform, and to stay out of the way of the business decisions. Rickey never operated that way, not once, and Steinbrenner spent years cycling between praising him publicly and cutting him down in the press because he never quite figured out what to do with someone who was simultaneously this valuable and this impossible. Number 5. Don Mattingly and Dave Winfield. New York sharpened every edge of the Rickey Henderson problem because New York already had two enormous personalities in the lineup before Rickey ever arrived, and neither of them was looking for more complexity. Don Mattingly was the homegrown captain, quiet and gritty, a man who played through injuries that would have ended most careers without saying a word about it. He was the lunch pail hero, the humble workhorse, the image the Yankees wanted to project to their fans. And Dave Winfield was the alpha, a physically massive Hall of Famer with his own complicated and often explosive history with Steinbrenner. Between the two of them, the dynamic in that clubhouse was already loaded. Into that environment walked Rickey Henderson. On paper, what the three of them together could do was almost unfair. Rickey at the top causing chaos, Mattingly driving in runs with precision, Winfield providing the thunder. The so-called three-headed monster was a legitimate nightmare for opposing pitching staffs. In theory, it should have been seamless. In practice, the friction came from perception. Rickey's goals always seemed pointed inward. He wanted runs. He wanted stolen bases. He wanted to build a legacy through numbers that would outlast everyone else's. The team winning mattered to him, and his performance genuinely helped the team win. But the people around him were never fully certain that the team winning was the main thing driving him. And in a place like New York, where the media already had microscopes pointed at everything happening inside that clubhouse, perception had a way of becoming reality very quickly. The game on August 2nd, 1985 against the White Sox became one of the ugly symbols of that entire era. A base-running mistake by two Yankees players resulted in both of them arriving at home plate at almost the same time. Carlton Fisk, playing for Chicago, tagged both of them out in a stunning display of veteran awareness. It was a disaster, and while Rickey was the batter on the play rather than one of the runners, the whole chaotic mess got folded into the broader story that the old guard was already telling about the individualistic culture rotting the Yankees from within. Too many stars. Not enough team. Too many guys thinking about themselves. Mattingly later made his peace with all of it. He said he had enormous respect for Rickey, called him a great person, and admitted that Rickey's disciplined approach to his own body was something Mattingly wished he had applied to himself. Winfield, as we all know now, was the very first person to announce Rickey's death and to call him a favorite teammate and a great friend. But during those years in pinstripes, the label stuck. Rickey was the face of the Me First Yankees, whether he fully earned that label or not. Number 4. Nolan Ryan. If any player in the history of the sport was built to represent everything the old guard of baseball believed in, it was Nolan Ryan. A power pitcher from Texas who believed in pure, undecorated competition, man against man, raw heat against the best hitters alive. No tricks, no theater, no games. Just an arm like a cannon and the willpower to use it for 27 years. He threw the ball just as hard at 40 as most pitchers managed at 22. He did it with a quiet toughness and a total absence of drama that the baseball establishment admired without reservation. Rickey Henderson, on the base paths, was Ryan's exact and complete opposite. Rickey danced, literally. He would shift his weight from side to side in a rhythmic, constant motion between the bases that was designed purely to scramble the pitcher's focus. He took enormous leads off first base, moving in the spaces just outside the pitcher's field of vision, forcing repeated throws over to first, and forcing the pitcher to keep resetting his entire delivery sequence. He made the game feel like performance art, and Ryan had zero patience for any of it. In that era, a pitcher who felt he was being shown up had a direct and accepted response. You threw inside, high and tight. Sometimes you actually hit the man. It was called a message pitch, and it was not just tolerated, it was expected as the natural way that pitchers defended the territory of the mound. Ryan was known to throw hard and inside at Rickey specifically to push him back toward the bag and remind him that the pitcher was still in charge out there. Now here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. On May 1st, 1991, two things happened in Major League Baseball on the exact same day. In Oakland, Rickey Henderson stole his 939th career base, breaking Lou Brock's all-time record. In Texas, on that very same night, Nolan Ryan threw his 7th and final no-hitter. Two historic moments, one single day, and the public reaction to the two of them could not have been more different. Ryan's achievement was greeted as the purest kind of legend, a 44-year-old man standing on a mound, throwing a complete game no-hitter against major league hitters. Nobody questioned his character. Nobody complicated the story. Ryan was simply a hero, clean and uncomplicated. Rickey's achievement, which by the cold logic of baseball statistics was just as extraordinary, got complicated almost immediately by the speech that followed. And the contrast between how the sport treated those two moments on that single night tells you everything about what baseball was really measuring. There is one more layer to the Ryan and Rickey relationship that deserves its own moment. Back in 1989, Ryan struck out Rickey Henderson to record his 5,000th career strikeout. 5,000, one of the most celebrated individual milestones in the history of pitching. And Rickey's response to being on the wrong end of that moment was to say, if he ain't struck you out, then you ain't nobody. It was a compliment wrapped inside classic Rickey. He was telling you that being Ryan's 5,000th strikeout victim was actually a badge of honor, proof that you were somebody worth remembering. It was strange and it was genuine, and in its own way, it told you exactly how much Rickey respected Ryan, even while spending years making him absolutely furious. Number 3. Bob Boone. Bob Boone thought about the game in a very particular and deliberate way. He believed that baseball had a rhythm, and that rhythm was not just a nice idea. It was the structure the game was built on. The flow from pitch to pitch, from at-bat to at-bat, from inning to inning. All of it was supposed to work together like a finely tuned machine. Every player understood their role in keeping that machine running, and Bob Boone, as the catcher, believed he was the man in charge of setting the pace. Rickey Henderson broke the machine every single time he came to the plate. When Rickey stepped into the batter's box, the pace of everything dropped. He would take his time getting settled, adjust his batting gloves with great care, tighten his helmet just so, step back out, adjust again, reset his stance, do the whole thing over. It was relentless, it was deliberate, and it was completely intentional. Before a single pitch had been thrown, Rickey was already inside the pitcher's head, making him wait, making him think, making him hold his physical tension for far longer than any pitcher wanted. Once Rickey got on base, things got even worse for the opposing team. His leads off first were enormous, his movements unpredictable, his timing designed to force the pitcher into repeated throws to the bag. The game ground down every single time Rickey reached base. In the era before the pitch clock, nothing could legally stop him from doing this. Boone later said that Rickey could routinely stretch the gap between pitches out to 40 or 50 seconds. Multiply that across an entire game, and you had a fundamentally different experience than what baseball was supposed to be. Boone believed this was not just an irritation. It was a calculated assault on the catcher's authority over the game. The catcher was supposed to set the tempo. That was part of the position. That was part of the contract between a catcher and his pitcher. Rickey simply refused to honor that contract, and he did it with full awareness of what he was doing. That was the part Boone could not forgive. Not the delay itself, the deliberateness of it. The fact that Rickey knew exactly what he was taking from the game and took it anyway. Number 2. Carlton Fisk. Carlton Fisk was baseball's conscience in cleats. A Hall of Fame catcher who caught games through injuries that would have ended most careers, who played every pitch of every game as if his entire identity depended on the outcome, and who treated the standards of the sport as sacred things worth protecting and enforcing. He was the on-field general, the enforcer, the man other players looked to as proof that the game still had standards. Rickey Henderson was the most direct and sustained challenge to everything Fisk stood for. It started in September of 1983 during a game in which Oakland pitcher Mike Warren was throwing a no-hitter against the White Sox. Fisk was the final out, a fly ball hit to Rickey in left field. The stadium was completely still. A no-hitter is one of the rarest events in the game, a thing that gets talked about for decades, and the final out carries the full weight of that moment. When the ball settled into Rickey's glove, he caught it one-handed with a dramatic, sweeping flourish. He called it his snatch catch. It was to him a way of adding style to a historic moment, a signature on a painting. To Fisk, it was a desecration. The no-hitter deserved reverence. The pitcher who had just thrown it deserved a clean and dignified final out. The batter who made it deserved to be retired with respect rather than theater. Instead, Rickey had turned the final out of a no-hitter into a personal highlight. He had made the whole thing about himself in a moment that was supposed to be about the pitcher, and Fisk, who believed deeply that the game was bigger than any individual, never forgot it. The conflict became public and famous when Fisk screamed at Rickey in front of everyone for not running out a pop fly. Fisk's belief on this point was absolute. Every single ball that made contact with the bat required a full sprint to first base. No exceptions, no excuses. It did not matter how obvious it was that the ball was going to be caught. You ran because running showed respect for the game. Running showed effort. Running showed that you cared. Rickey thought this was theater. Why sprint full speed on a ball that was clearly going to be caught? The only thing you were guaranteed to get out of it was the chance to pull a muscle for no purpose. He was protecting himself for moments that actually mattered. He called it smart baseball. But in the court of public opinion inside the sport, not running out a pop fly was one of the most visible things a player could do to signal that he did not care. Every single person in the stadium could see it. Every camera caught it. And when Carlton Fisk, one of the most respected men in the sport, pointed his finger and screamed at Rickey on the field in front of everyone, it did not just feel like one player yelling at another. It felt like a verdict. Baseball had decided Rickey Henderson was not playing the right way. And in a sport where playing the right way was treated as a matter of personal honor, that verdict carried real weight. Number 1, Lou Brock. This is the one. The single moment that took every individual grievance, every specific conflict, every quiet whisper from every catcher and pitcher and teammate and owner, and crystallized it all into one image that baseball could never move past. May 1st, 1991. Oakland Coliseum. Rickey Henderson stole his 939th career base, passing Lou Brock to become the all-time stolen base leader in the history of Major League Baseball. Lou Brock was there in person. He had been invited specifically to be present for the occasion, to stand as the living monument of what had come before, to shake the new king's hand. He was standing on the field as an honored guest. And then Rickey picked up third base, held it above his head like a man holding a crown, leaned toward the microphone and spoke. Lou Brock was the symbol of great base stealing, but today I'm the greatest of all time. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The kind that comes when something is said that nobody was ready for. Brock was standing right there. Rickey had just referred to him in the past tense, as if the story were already closed, as if Brock's time had ended and Rickey's time had fully replaced it. He had not thanked him, had not deferred to him, had not reached for the humble, standing on the shoulders of a giant language that baseball expected in those moments. The reaction was swift and it was largely negative. To the traditionalist baseball world, this was the worst possible thing a player could say at the worst possible moment. The accepted and expected script for breaking a major record was well understood by everyone. You thank the man whose record you broke. You talk about learning from him, about honoring his legacy, about how you hope your achievement adds to the sport, rather than diminishing what came before. You are gracious. You are humble. You perform the ritual of deference that tells the old guard you understand your place. Rickey did none of that. And baseball carried that moment like a stone for the rest of his career and beyond. It became the reference point, the thing people reached for whenever they needed an example of what was wrong with him. Now here's the nuance that the research makes clear, and it matters. Rickey was not planning an insult. He was not sitting in the dugout beforehand, rehearsing ways to embarrass Lou Brock on national television. He grew up idolizing Muhammad Ali more than he idolized any baseball player. Ali's "I am the greatest" declaration, the fearless, unashamed proclamation of self-belief that Ali turned into both his armor and his weapon, was the language Rickey had internalized since he was young. When he stood on that field and said, "I'm the greatest of all time," he was speaking from that place. He was paying tribute to that spirit in the only language he had ever learned to speak. Brock himself later revealed something important. Before the ceremony, he had offered to help Rickey write a speech. He told Rickey he would help him find the right words for the moment. Rickey turned it down. He told Brock he wanted to speak from the heart. And he did. The problem was that speaking from the heart, in Rickey's case, produced something that baseball simply did not have the cultural vocabulary to receive. Think about the pure numbers for a moment. Rickey ended his career with 1,406 stolen bases. Brock finished with 938. That is a gap of 468 stolen bases. That gap alone is bigger than what most players manage to steal across their entire careers. Rickey was not slightly better than Lou Brock. He was not nudging past a record by a slim margin. He was in a completely different dimension of the same sport. And yet the speech became the story. The words overshadowed the numbers. Because in baseball's unwritten code, the manner of victory mattered just as much as the victory itself. And Rickey had won in a way the old guard could not find it in themselves to accept. Now we have been all the way through it, number 9 down to number 1. And if you pull back and look at the whole picture, something becomes clear that is easy to miss when you are looking at each conflict individually. Every single person on this list had a legitimate reason for their frustration. Eckersley had standards he believed in. Fisk had standards. Boone had standards. Gibson had standards. These were not small men looking for reasons to knock down someone better than them. These were serious competitors who believed in a version of the game that Rickey Henderson was actively dismantling every single day he stepped onto a field. But here is the other thing that stands out equally clearly. Almost none of the criticisms were actually about what Rickey did when the game was on the line. They were about how he carried himself. They were about what he looked like when the pitch clock was running and the cameras were rolling and the old guard was watching. The actual baseball, the thing that is supposed to matter most, was beyond criticism. He hit. He got on base at an astonishing rate throughout his career. He scored more runs than anyone who ever played the game. He changed what opposing pitchers could do just by standing in the on-deck circle. He won 2 World Series. He won the Most Valuable Player award. He led the league in stolen bases at 39 years old while posting 66 steals and 118 walks. He could barely hit for power anymore, and he was still one of the most dangerous offensive players in the league. The all-time records are almost too big to hold in your head at once. 1,406 stolen bases, 2,295 runs scored, the most in the history of professional baseball, 2,190 career walks, 81 leadoff home runs, more than anyone who ever lived. These are not the numbers of a showboat. These are the numbers of a player who fundamentally changed what a baseball offense could look like. So why did MLB never forgive him? Because what Rickey Henderson represented was not just a different style of playing the game. He represented a different way of thinking about the whole thing from the ground up. He was business first. He was body first. He was unashamed about knowing his own worth in a sport that had always demanded players perform humility as a price of admission. He was a preview of the player empowerment era, of athletes understanding that they had value, of the idea that a professional could protect his brand and his health and his financial interests and still be the best player in the world at the same time. The old guard hated that. Not because it was wrong, but because it was new. And in a sport that ran on tradition and unwritten rules, new was the most dangerous thing there was. Then he was gone. Complications from pneumonia. And something shifted in a way that did not fully surprise anyone who had been paying attention. Winfield broke the news before anyone else did. He posted that he could not believe he had lost one of his favorite teammates. A great friend. The contract fights were not mentioned. The personality clashes were not mentioned. Just a man in real pain at the loss of someone he genuinely loved. Mattingly said similar things. The warmth in his words was not performance. It was not a public gesture. It was real. The respect was real. Even the people who had called Rickey the most difficult player they ever shared a locker room with were now talking about the privilege of having been around him. And then you remember what he said at his Hall of Fame induction in 2009. After a career built entirely on loud declarations, after decades of speaking about himself in the third person, after "I am the greatest" and "Rickey says" and all of it, he stood at that podium on the biggest stage of his life, and he closed with 4 words. Today, I am very, very humble. He knew. He had always known. The persona was the engine, not the man. The third person was a tool. The dancing and the snatch catches and the 40-second delays at the plate were all part of the machinery he had built to make himself go. He had constructed a mythology around himself because that mythology was what gave him the fuel to do what he did. And what he did was be the greatest leadoff hitter who ever lived. The greatest base runner, the all-time leader in stolen bases, the all-time leader in runs scored, a 2-time World Series champion, a first-ballot Hall of Famer, a man who, by the bare numbers of the game, has no equal at what he did. MLB never forgave him for how he went about it. But not one person on this list, not Eckersley, not Fisk, not Gossage, not even Steinbrenner, ever seriously argued that someone else should have Rickey's records. Because deep down, they all knew there will never be another Rickey Henderson. He did not just break baseball's records. He broke baseball's idea of what a star was supposed to look like. He was louder, bolder, more self-aware, and more honest about his own greatness than the game had ever been asked to handle. And maybe that was exactly the point. There's a reason every single team he played for got better when he was healthy and available. There is a reason that even the players who could not stand his personality still talk about him in hushed, respectful tones when his name comes up. The game of baseball does not produce players like Rickey Henderson very often. In fact, it is entirely possible the game will never produce another one. What he did on a baseball field was a completely separate category of excellence from everyone around him. The records prove it. The rings prove it. The way people talk about him decades after his last at-bat proves it. If you think Rickey was a hero, a villain, or something in between, drop your take in the comments right now. If you enjoyed this one, hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next video. We will see you there.